Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We got a special guest on the line this morning. We have Congresswoman Yvette Clarke. Welcome.
Great to be with you, DJ Envy. How you doing?
How are you doing today? I'm doing great. Now,
Well, it's
tomorrow's
another
a big
day
day in the
above
city.
ground, so we making it happen, right?
Absolutely. Now, tomorrow's a big day in the city. Explaining to people what's going on in New York. If they don't know, they should know.
Yeah, absolutely. In New York State, it is election day. And I want to make sure that people realize while we in these streets, pressing protests for change, the ultimate change actually comes through the ballot box. And that's something that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King taught us. We can unleash our power in multiple ways. I think we definitely need to stay in these streets, but we need to register our real desire for change at the ballot box. So I'm encouraging everyone who has a vote, let's overwhelm the polling stations tomorrow. Let's go out and vote, and let's make sure that we are electing those who are in keeping with our progress.
Now, how's it looking in New York? Because we see in a lot of other states, there's been some issues with the amount of polling stations where people can actually go and vote. So what's happening in New York? What are some things that we should know about?
Yeah, Angela, it's been really challenging. We know that COVID-19 has definitely kind of made things a bit challenging for people. So New York State, for the first time with the statewide election, started early voting in state elections. That gave limited polling places. And early voting ended yesterday. A number of folk did avail themselves of that ability to vote and vote safely without lines and what have you. They also made it possible for people to vote from home. So people were mailed applications. They had to send the application back. They then had to receive their ballot in the mail. Ultimately, if you haven't mailed back your ballot, it has to be postmarked by today. So I want to encourage folks, we can't rely on the Postal Service right now. They're overwhelmed. They're a lifeline during this period of COVID-19. Tomorrow, our polling stations that we would typically go to will be open. So I want to encourage people, if you have not either availed yourself of the early vote or of mail-in ballots, please go out and exercise your right to vote. Polling stations are open from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Go at your leisure, wear your mask, and make sure you cast your ballot.
Absolutely.
Why is it recommended for people to vote early?
Well, it was recommended that people vote early because then you tend not to get into a crowded situation. We know that in districts like mine, for instance, people will typically vote after work. That's when you'll see a larger number of people at the polling station. We want to make sure that people can socially distance. We want to make sure that people can cast their ballot safely. And so, the earlier you vote in a day, the less likely you are to run into crowds.
So I know it's been very challenging in your district, what you represent, because of coronavirus, because of police brutality, because there's been a lot of protesting going on. So what are some things that you think are front and center right now? What are some issues?
Yeah, I mean, certainly front of mind for folks have been racial injustice. People have actually put their lives on the line in the midst of a pandemic to do massive demonstrations throughout the 9th District of New York. And they've been consistent every day, since we were under stay-at-home order and had to witness, the killing, the murder of George Floyd. I think that it has just risen up something in the fiber of everyone's being. And people want to see systemic change, and I think it's happening very quickly in real time. We see, at our city level, our state level, at our national level, across the country, legislation being advanced to get rid of what has been, the blue wall of silence, making sure that we can demilitarize police departments across this country, reimagining what policing actually looks like. We hear about the defund police movement has been growing a lot of strength. And, I think that this is a moment for this generation. And what really lifts me up in this moment is the fact that it is an intergenerational movement. It is a multiracial movement. And I think that, if we continue to keep the pressure on, there, not only is there a breakthrough in terms of police reform, in terms of healthcare, education, housing justice, there's just been a number of pieces of legislation that particularly members like me in the Congressional Black Caucus have been trying to get to the forefront of the legislative process, and the pressure that is in the streets right now really has enabled us to do so. But aside from that, Angela, there's a humanitarian crisis right now in our communities. There are folk in our communities who have not been able to work under stay-at-home orders. Many have been laid off. Many are furloughed, and they're just looking for ways to stay afloat. They're looking for ways to feed their families. We've been doing a lot of food distribution, a lot of expanding our pantries, because, families that were barely making ends meet prior to the COVID crisis are now in a situation where they're underwater. And one of the things that we did in Washington that we have to keep the pressure on is we passed a bill that would continue to provide for our families a lifeline of financial support, make sure that rent and mortgages are paid, make sure that people have access to testing, isolation. The pandemic is not over. Yes, our numbers have come down in New York State, in New York City, in my district, but at tremendous loss of life. I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that so many of our family members were taken by this COVID crisis. And so we've got to stay vigilant in this space. I keep reminding people, this pandemic started with one person in Hunan, China. And now it's a worldwide pandemic with thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives being lost. We can't afford a relapse. So we need to stay vigilant in this space. We need to help our brothers and sisters that are struggling out there. If you have the means to be able to help a food pantry, help one of the institutions that are feeding folk, take the time and do that, because our families are really challenged right now.
And defunding the police,
Congresswoman
what are your
Clarke,
thoughts on defunding? I was going to ask you, you said defunding the police. What are your thoughts on defunding the police?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about how do we look at the fact that in the city of New York, we've had a steep decline in crime, but we've continued to see a maintenance of effort, if not an increase in funding to the NYPD. I think that the needs of our community can be met if we cut the budgets proportional to the decrease in crime. We can then fund the programs that help train and provide opportunities to young people in the community. We can make sure that we subsidize housing. Our people are like hanging on, just trying to keep a roof over their head. You can't have a stay-at-home order if you don't have a home to stay in, and so there are a lot of injustices that can be addressed if we set our financial priorities straight. And right now, people are saying, listen, the NYPD is an elite paramilitary institution in New York City. They have the means and ability to address security of our communities without brutalizing, without occupying our communities. We can bring in folks who can help us with mental health challenges and trauma, because we're going through a lot of trauma right now, seeing so many people in our community get sick, seeing our elders and others pass, good friends and family members. We need to get some therapy going. And that funding should be redirected to creating a therapeutic environment in which our communities can thrive. And that's what I'm calling for.
I agree with you. Now, Congressman Clarke, you talked about police reform, right? Legislation can't change behavior, clearly, because we saw this weekend a cop choking out the brother in Far Rockaway, Queens, I think it was. So what do you do in a situation like that? Because they just suspended the cop without pay. This guy's got a history of police brutality. I feel like he should be terminated.
Yeah, unfortunately, so like in some states, you have a right to work where you can immediately terminate folk, like in Georgia. In New York State, the union dynamic goes through a certain number of steps before you can even get to that point. And that's been, I think, a source of frustration in New York City, because that's where, you know, things get dicey. We see, you know, the lawyers jump in, and we see, you know, all of the different rigmarole that we go through in terms of the department and what their procedures are. I think there needs to be a real conversation and re-engineering of how we actually hold police accountable in the city of New York. And legislation does that. The problem is that, you know, we've entered into contracts with different unions. Of course, all workers are entitled to due process, but that is really the challenge in New York State. It's that the due process has been obstructed by a whole host of contract negotiations that help, you know, bad apples, bad cops to evade justice. And we got to do away with it. This is the 21st century. People aren't having it. I'm not having it. And I think some of what we're trying to do in Washington will help us to get past this point where, you know, the way that we're policed, the regulations that govern it will be modernized to reflect the reality of what we've experienced as Black folk in this town and across this country.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Well, we appreciate you for checking in. And tomorrow, get out there and vote, vote, vote,
Yes.
vote, vote. Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ms.
Yes, it's
Clarke.
always a pleasure. You know, I'm a big supporter of Congresswoman Yvette D. Clarke, so I appreciate you for joining us this morning. And everybody, please make sure in New York you go out and vote tomorrow.
That's right.
Thank you so much, The Breakfast Club. Y'all always keep it rocking. You keep our people informed. God bless. God keep you. Stay strong. Stay healthy. Stay blessed.
Thank you.
And stay Black.
Thank you
Stay
so much.
Black,
Absolutely.
baby.